It's a great pleasure today to welcome Billy Collins to Brigham Young University. And what will even be a greater pleasure to all us audience members is how Billy Collins will welcome us. For he has done a very important thing for contemporary American poetry. He has renovated the entryway so that it has large sliding glass doors that he keeps open for readers to come in and go out of, to dip their feet in the reflecting pool or soak in the hot tub, to sit on the wide lawn, watch the rhododendrons, smell the cornflowers at dusk, and then to come inside for a chat about shoveling snow with Buddha, or a dog barking to Beethoven, or the activities of angels. He will be playing jazz on the stereo. He will give you a comfortable chair, a table to write on, and a pot of tea. He will drink coffee. In short, in Billy Collins' poetry, readers feel welcome, invited. And I've lost my page. What has made him such a significant poet and such an important United States Poet Laureate in our generation is that he believes a poem should be, I quote, easy to enter, like a building. An accessible poem has a clear entrance, he says, a front door through which the reader may pass into the body of the poem. He also says, if you need to cut an entrance into a poem, who is going to bother? Why should a reader be asked to commit repeated acts of breaking and entering? I think this is very important for American poetry because it implies that poetry ought to be an art poets create for other people, not just for themselves, suggesting that there might be an audience for poetry beyond poets is a very important thing. And his own success, the success of his books, demonstrates that, indeed, there are intelligent and enthusiastic readers like us, here today, eager to be engaged with poetry if that poetry is interesting in touching both our emotions and our intellect. Billy Collins may consider in a poem anything from Aristotle's Poetics to the catapults of the Middle Ages to Chinese poems of the Sung Dynasty, but he always proceeds in a way that includes rather than excludes readers. To change metaphors, Billy Collins has asked, quote, if a poem has no clear starting place, how can it go anywhere? If a poem does not begin in lucidity, how can it advance into the mysterious? If you listen carefully today, you will hear his poems advance from the lucidity into the mysterious. And let us all welcome Billy Collins and thank him for being here to take us on that journey.
Thank you very much. You can hear me okay? Thank you very much for that thoughtful introduction, and thank you for including me in the invocation. I'm very happy to be here, and glad to see so many of you. I like a large audience. It's always good. I thought I would start by reading a few poems about the habits of poets or poetry itself. Poets are not quite like other people. There's something different about us. And maybe a few of these poems will shed some light on those differences. The first poem is called Monday, and it's called that because it concerns just the kind of daily workaday habits of poets. Monday. The birds are in their trees, the toast is in the toaster, and the poets are at their windows. They are at their windows in every section of the tangerine of earth, the Chinese poets looking up at the moon, the American poets gazing out at the pink and blue ribbons of sunrise. The clerks are at their desks, the miners are down in their mines, and the poets are looking out their windows, maybe with a cigarette, a cup of tea, or maybe a flannel shirt or a bathrobe is involved. The proofreaders are playing the ping-pong game of proofreading, glancing back and forth from page to page. The chefs are dicing celery and potatoes, and the poets are at their windows because it is their job, for which they are paid nothing, every Friday afternoon. Which window, it hardly seems to matter, though many have a favorite, for there is always something to see, a bird grasping a thin branch, the headlights of a taxi rounding a corner, those two boys in wool caps angling across the street. The fishermen bob in their boats, the linemen climb their round poles, the barbers wait by their mirrors and chairs, and the poets continue to stare at the cracked bird bath or a limb knocked down by the wind. By now it should go without saying that what the oven is to the baker and the berry-stained blouse to the dry cleaner, so the window is to the poet. Just think, before the invention of the window, the poets would have to put on a jacket and a winter hat to go outside, or remain indoors with only a wall to stare at. And when I say a wall, I do not mean a wall with striped wallpaper and a sketch of a cow in a frame. I mean a cold wall of fieldstones, the wall of the medieval sonnet, the original woman's heart of stone, the stone caught in the throat of her poet lover. Thank you so much. This is a poem that gets around to poetry fairly quickly. It's based on a photograph that was a shot. I have a little cold, so if I dribble or cough or something, I might even have a paroxysm up here, but we'll wait for that to arrive. Harold Edgerton was an experimental photographer from Nebraska, and he specialized in what he called stroboscopic photography, where he would time the strobe light with high-speed photography in an attempt to arrest these moments of usually of violent impact, of a foot kicking a football or explosions and that kind of thing. So his photographs showed us through high-speed photography what these moments looked like, actions too violent and sudden for the human eye to catch. And the title of the poem is Ballistics. When I came across the high-speed photograph of a bullet that had just pierced a book, the pages exploding with the velocity, I forgot all about the marvels of photography and began to wonder which book the photographer had selected for the shot. Many novels sprang to mind, including those of Raymond Chandler, where an extra bullet would hardly be noticed. Nonfiction offered too many choices, a history of Scottish lighthouses, a biography of Joan of Arc, and so forth. Or it could be an anthology of medieval literature, the bullet having just beheaded Sir Gawain and scattered the band of assorted pilgrims. But later, as I was drifting off to sleep, I realized that the executed book was a recent collection of poems written by someone of whom I was not fond, and that the bullet must have passed through his writing with little resistance at 2,800 feet per second, through the poems about his sorry childhood, the ones about the dreary state of the world, and then through the author's photograph, through the beard, the round glasses, and that special poet's hat he loves to wear. Sure. You probably know him, or some version of him. There's a lot of him going around, actually. And this one's called How Poets Read Prose. I recall a friend once admitting that all he remembered after reading Anna Karenina was something about a picnic basket. And now, after consuming a book devoted to the subject of Barcelona, its people, its history, its complex architecture, all I remember is the mention of an albino gorilla who inhabited a park where the citadel of the Bourbons once stood. The sheer paleness of her looms over all the other names and dates in the book, as the evening strollers stop by her cage and point to show their children. These locals called her Snowflake, and here she has been mentioned in print again, which might keep her pale flame alive and help her, despite her name, to endure in this poem where she belongs. Oh, Snowflake, I had no interest in the capital of Catalonia, its people, its history, its complex architecture. No, you were the reason I kept the light on all those nights, turning all those pages, searching for you everywhere. Thank you. The notebooks of Robert Frost were published just last year, and they're quite interesting. I mean, in that a journal or a notebook is what a man or a woman writes down at the moment, what's on their mind at the moment, and so lots of little incomprehensible scribblings and nonsense, but then there are actually some drafts of poems, but just like Snowflake popped out of that book for me, there was one little comment in a corner of Frost's journal that arrested my attention, and he wrote, I have always envied the four-moon planet. And someone can tell me later if there actually is a four-moon planet. I think it's Jupiter, maybe, but the fact that Frost would find that enviable seemed odd to me. So I wrote this poem called "The Four-Moon Planet." Maybe he was thinking of the song "What a Little Moonlight Can Do," and became curious about what a lot of moonlight might be capable of. But would this not be too much of a good thing? And what if you couldn't tell them apart, and they always rose together at the same time, like pale quadruplets entering our living room? Sure, there would be enough light to read a book or write a letter at midnight, and if you drank enough tequila, you might see 8 of them roving brightly above. But think of the 2 lovers on a beach, his arm around her bare shoulder, thrilled at how close they were feeling tonight, while he gazed at one moon and she another. Thanks. I guess in any writing workshop or instructions to writers, one of the early things you hear is that the enemy of the truly creative writer is the cliche that good writers, I think George Orwell pointed out, write by putting individual words together, and not so good writers staple phrases and cliches together. But cliches have their own interest, and I do some. This poem contains some play with them, and it's called Adage. Adage. When it's late at night and branches are banging against the windows, you might think that love is just a matter of leaping out of the frying pan of yourself into the fire of someone else. But it's a little more complicated than that. It's more like trading the 2 birds who might be hiding in that bush for the one you are not holding in your hand. A wise man once said that love was like forcing a horse to drink, but then everyone stopped thinking of him as wise. Let us be clear about something. Love is not as simple as getting up on the wrong side of the bed wearing the emperor's clothes. No, it's more like the way the pen feels after it has defeated the sword. It's a little like the penny saved or the 9 drop stitches. You look at me through the halo of the last candle and tell me love is an ill wind that has no turning, a road that blows no good. But I am here to remind you, as our shadows tremble on the walls, that love is the early bird who is better late than never. Thank you. Recently, I've been working on what's become a kind of series of poems that seem to have one thing in common, and that is the poems seem to be nothing more than reactions to their own titles, as if the poem, was not responsible for its title, which sounds like I've reached a kind of wheel spinning dead end, but I'm pursuing this, and I'm going to read two of them, quite new poems. The first one is called Hippos on Holiday. Hippos on Holiday is really not the title of a movie, but if it was, I would be sure to see it. I love their short legs and big heads, the whole hippo look. Hundreds of them would frolic in the mud of a wide, slow-moving river, and I would eat my popcorn in the dark of a neighborhood theater. When they opened their enormous mouths lined with big stubby teeth, I would drink my enormous Coke. I would be both in my seat and in the water playing with the hippos, which is the way it is with a truly great movie. Only a mean-spirited reviewer would ask, on holiday from what? Sometimes when I finish writing a poem like that, I feel like the attendant is going to arrive to take me for my walk through the grounds of a very exclusive mental hospital somewhere. So the other poem in this series is called Bathtub Families. Bathtub families is not just a phrase I made up, though it would have given me pleasure to have written these words in a notebook, then looked up at the sky, wondering what they meant. No, I saw bathtub families in a pharmacy on the label of a clear plastic package containing 1 cow and 4 calves, a little family of animals meant to float in your tub. I hesitated to buy it because I knew I would then want the entire series of bathtub families, which would leave no room in the tub for the turtles, the pigs, the seals, the giraffes, and me. It's enough just to have the words, which alone make me even more grateful that I was born in America and English is my mother tongue. I was lucky, too, that I waited for the pharmacist to fill my prescription. Otherwise, I might not have wandered down the aisle with the bathtub families. I think what I am really saying is that language is better than reality, so it doesn't have to be bath time for you to enjoy all the bathtub families as they float in the air around your head. So. I think I'm going to read a couple of poems about dogs, and this is a rather short 12-line poem in which the dog speaks, actually. There's an interesting little book called Unleashed, which is a anthology of poems written by dogs with the approval of their masters, of course. But the best one in there, I think, is written by Ben Sonnenberg. And there's a picture of his dog, and then the dog's date, so you know that the dog is no longer with us. And the dog's poem is a very short poem. It's titled Stay. I was a bad dog and wouldn't obey any command until today. It's sad, yeah. It has the same, it strikes me that it has the same poignancy as, there's a tiny 2-line poem by Howard Nemeroff called Bacon and Eggs. Bacon and eggs. The chicken contributes, but the pig gives his all. It's this is kind of a real diversion, but I had the interesting job or whatever of just a couple of weeks ago of interviewing Paul Simon on stage. We had kind of a live interview, and he had his guitar with him, and he played some stuff. And I brought up the subject of whether pop lyrics have to make sense or not. And I gave it as an example, one of my favorite pop songs of all time, which is Whiter Shade of Pale. And I don't understand a word of that song. I don't want to understand it, but it's still enjoyable. And I asked him about a song of his called Mother and Child Reunion. Do you know that one? And I said, that sounds like a good thing, Mother and Child Reunion. But all the lyrics are about this sad and mournful day, and it's a very negative song. And I said, what kind of sense does that make to call a mother and child reunion sad and mournful? And he said, there's always this little backstory. He said, well, I was at a Chinese restaurant. I figured now we're getting somewhere. And on the menu of the Chinese restaurant was a dish called Mother and Child Reunion. And I said, well, what did it consist of? And he said, well, it was chicken with scrambled eggs. So I said, well, now I see why it's so sad. I mean, geez. It's really kind of frightening, really. So let's look at a few dogs here. This is the dog speaking. It's called, as I said, 12 lines long. A dog on his master. As young as I look, I am growing older faster than he. 7-to-1 is the ratio they tend to say. Whatever the number, I will pass him one day and take the lead, the way I do on our walks in the woods. And if this ever manages to cross his mind, it will be the sweetest shadow I have ever cast on snow or grass. The other dog poem is basically a poem just about my dog. It's called Dharma, and Dharma is a very kind of undefinable word, but it has to do with spirituality. And I called the poem Dharma because I'm trying to figure out if this dog has a kind of spiritual side to her. Dharma. The way the dog trots out the front door every morning without a hat or an umbrella, without any money or the keys to her doghouse, never fails to fill the saucer of my heart with milky admiration. Who provides a finer example of a life without encumbrance? Thoreau, in his curtainless hut with a single plate, a single spoon? Gandhi, with his staff and his wire spectacles? Off she goes into the material world with nothing but her brown coat and her modest blue collar, following only her wet nose, the twin portals of her steady breathing, followed only by the plume of her tail. If only she did not shove the cat aside every morning and eat all his food. What a model of self-containment she would be. What a paragon of earthly detachment. If only she were not so eager for a rub behind the ears, so acrobatic in her welcomes. If only I were not her God. Thank you. The trouble with writing poems about dogs is that, or any kind of house pet, I guess, is that you can quickly get very sentimental, as that poem kind of does at the end there. I usually, when I'm writing, I don't have much of an agenda. I just have a notion, and I'm curious to pursue it through writing lines of verse. In this case, I did have an intention, and the intention was to try to write a poem about a dog that was very lacking in sentimentality, a very dry-eyed look. And here again, it's the creature who speaks. It's called the Revenant, which is just a big Latin word for a ghost or a spirit. The Revenant. I am the dog you put to sleep, as you like to call the needle of oblivion. Come back to tell you this simple thing. I never liked you. When I licked your face, I thought of biting off your nose. When I watched you toweling yourself dry, I wanted to leap and unman you with a snap. I resented the way you moved, your lack of animal grace, the way you would sit in a chair to eat, a napkin on your lap, a knife in your hand. I would have run away, but I was too weak, a trick you taught me while I was learning to sit and heal, and greatest of insults, shake hands without a hand. I admit the sight of the leash would excite me, but only because it meant I was about to smell things you had never touched. You do not want to believe this, but I have no reason to lie. I hated the car, hated the rubber toys, disliked your friends, and worse, your relatives. The jingling of my tags drove me mad. You always scratched me in the wrong place. All I ever wanted from you was food and fresh water in my metal bowls. While you slept, I watched you breathe as the moon rose in the sky. It took all of my strength not to raise my head and howl. Now I am free of the collar, the yellow raincoat, monogram sweater, the absurdity of your lawn. And that is all you need to know about this place, except what you already supposed and are glad it did not happen sooner, that everyone here can read and write, the dogs in poetry, the cats and all the others in prose. Thank you. I was reading, speaking of prose and poetry, I guess I was at some moral or psychological low point. I was reading a book on how to write fiction. I don't know what I was thinking about, but in paging through it, I came across a series of do's and don'ts. It was very pitched very low, and one of the don'ts was a piece of advice I'd heard before, and I used it as the epigraph for this poem. And the piece of advice is, never use the word suddenly just to create tension. And I'd heard that one of the kind of the hallmarks of mediocre fiction is the overuse of the word suddenly, as in, this is the worst example I know of, I pointed the gun at her head and pulled the trigger. Suddenly, shots rang out. But I figured, well, I write poems, so I don't have to follow any of these rules. So the license I took resulted in this poem called Tension. Suddenly, you were planting some yellow petunias outside in the garden. And suddenly, I was in the study looking up the word oligarchy for the 37th time. When suddenly, without warning, you planted the last petunia in the flat, and I suddenly closed the dictionary now that I was reminded of that vile form of governance. A moment later, we found ourselves standing suddenly in the kitchen, where you suddenly opened a can of cat food, and I, just as suddenly, watched you doing that. I observed a window of leafy activity, and beyond that, a bird perched on the edge of a stone bird bath, when suddenly you announced you were leaving to pick up a few things at the market. And I stunned you by impulsively pointing out that we were getting low on butter, and another case of wine would not be a bad idea. Who could tell what the next moment would hold? Another drip from the faucet, another little spasm of the second hand. Would the painting of a bowl of pears continue to hang on the wall from that nail? Would the heavy anthologies remain on their shelves? Would the stove hold its position? Suddenly it was anyone's guess. The sun rose ever higher in the sky. The state capitals remained motionless on the wall map. When suddenly I found myself lying on a couch, or I closed my eyes and without any warning began to picture the Andes of all places, and a path that led over the mountain to another country with strange customs and eye-catching hats, suddenly fringed with colorful little tassels. Thank you. I'm going to read some shorter poems. I know Philip Larkin once said one of the many reasons he didn't like going to poetry readings is that he could never tell where the poem was going to end. And, when you see a poem on the page and hold it in your hand, you can see the ending coming up, and you can make emotional preparations for that ending. So all these, this little set is quite short. This one is a sonnet, and you know how long that is. I usually don't write in received forms, but I kind of knew what I wanted to say here, so I thought it would fit into a sonnet. And the poem is a reaction, and I'm quite new to Provo, so I don't know if this kind of thing happens around here, but it seems to happen just about everywhere else in the country if it doesn't happen here. And that is the sudden outcropping of condominium developments and gated communities and whatnot. And I'm always struck, besides the kind of ecological nightmares that some of them create, I'm always struck by the names that they give to these communities. And they're typically called names like, Deer Hollow or Badger Meadows or something like that. And if you think about it, these names are really epitaphs for, because these are the animals that were chased out of here in order to build these condominiums. So there's a sort of sadness to these names. So the reaction to that is this poem. It's called The Golden Years because I picture the speaker as being a retired guy. The Golden Years. All I do these drawn-out days is sit in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge, where there are no pheasant to be seen, and last time I looked, no ridge. Sure, I could drive over to Quail Falls and spend the day there playing bridge, but the lack of a falls and the absence of quail would only remind me of Pheasant Ridge. I know a widow at Fox Run and another with a condo at Smoky Ledge. One of them smokes and neither can run. So I'll stick to the pledge I made to Midge. Who frightened the fox and bulldozed the ledge? I ask in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge. And this is, thank you, and another, often a sentence will, what generates a poem is just a sentence popping out of the oddest place. And in this case, it was a book I was reading, or maybe an article, I forget, on the history of printing, and this sentence turned into the epigraph of this poem. The sentence is, "It has been calculated that each copy of the Gutenberg Bible required the skins of 300 sheep." Short poem called Flock. I can see them squeezed into the holding pen behind the stone building where the printing press is housed, all of them squirming around to find a little room, and looking so much alike it would be nearly impossible to count them, and there is no telling which one will carry the news that the Lord is a shepherd, one of the few things they already know. It's got to be one out there. And thank you. And this is a 9-line poem that is it's about, a rather common expression you hear today, especially if you're young or around the young. The title is "Oh My God." The expression is, oh my God. And the other expression is, I was like, oh my God. That's a little more difficult to understand. Thinking like, what kind of a question would that be the answer to? You could say, what were you like as a child? I was like, oh my God. You know. But this is this is just called, oh my God. Not only in church and nightly by their bedsides do young girls pray these days. Wherever they go, prayer is woven into their talk like a bright thread of awe. Even in the pedestrian mall, outbursts of praise spring unbidden from their glossy lips. Here's a 2-line poem, very important to remember the title. It's called Refrigerator Light. The instant she slams the door, I stop thinking about her. Anyway, I'll read, I have a book coming out this year, but the most recent one that is out is called The Trouble with Poetry. Excuse me, and I'll read the title poem from there. Thank you. The Trouble with Poetry. I think someone just thought of a memory and applauded it. The Trouble with Poetry. The trouble with poetry, I realized as I walked along a beach one night, cold Florida sand under my bare feet, a show of stars in the sky. The trouble with poetry is that it encourages the writing of more poetry, more guppies crowding the fish tank, more baby rabbits hopping out of their mothers into the dewy grass. And how will it ever end unless the day finally arrives when we have compared everything in the world to everything else in the world? And there is nothing left to do then but quietly close our notebooks and sit with our hands folded on our desks. Poetry fills me with joy, and I rise like a feather in the wind. Poetry fills me with sorrow, and I sink like a chain flung from a bridge. But mostly, poetry fills me with the urge to write poetry, to sit in the dark and wait for a little flame to appear at the tip of my pencil. And along with that, the longing to steal, to break into the poems of others with a flashlight and a ski mask. And what an unmerry band of thieves we are, cut purses, common shoplifters, I thought to myself as a cold wave swirled around my feet and the lighthouse moved its megaphone over the sea, which is an image I stole directly from Lawrence Ferlinghetti. To be perfectly honest for a moment, the bicycling poet of San Francisco, whose little amusement park of a book I used to carry in a side pocket of my uniform up and down the treacherous halls of high school. Thank you. That leads into, in that it talks about comparing everything in the world to everything else in the world, and because it involves a broad daylight bit of theft there, leads to another poem in which I steal lines from another poet and credit him, but it's a poem in which I take the first 2 lines of someone else's poem and kind of rewrite the poem for him, which is a kind of professional courtesy, you might consider it. And the reason I rewrote this poem is that it is I just came across it in the magazine. It's a love poem that's based on a completely outmoded presumption on the parts of male poets that they understood what women really wanted. And the presumption was that what women wanted was not was neither loyalty nor passion or respect or any of those things. What women wanted was similes. They wanted to be compared to stuff. And the more things you could think of to compare a woman to, the more headway you would make with her. And this poem I discovered was about maybe 40 lines of just one comparison after another. It's really like a Rolodex of comparison. So his first two lines as he addresses his beloved are, he says to her, "You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine." And I start the same way. The poem is called Litany. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh bird suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter, or the house of cards. And you are certainly not the pine-scented air. There is no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head, but you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show that you are neither the boots in the corner nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof. I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I am not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, not to mention the crystal goblet and somehow the wine. Thank you. It's fun to write. I have a friend who lives in rural Vermont. I'm pretty much was born and raised around New York City, and so when I would visit him, he would try to teach me things about country life, and this was one of the things he tried to teach me about. There was like deer hunting was involved, which for me was getting lost in the woods with a gun. It was a more realistic display of what it was. But this was a little piece of kind of indoors lore that he tried to school me in, and I had a hard time believing. It's called The Country. I wondered about you when you told me never to leave a box of wooden strike-anywhere matches just lying around the house because the mice might get into them and start a fire. But your face was absolutely straight when you twisted the lid down on the round tin where the matches, you said, are always stowed. Who could sleep that night? Who could whisk away the thought of the one unlikely mouse padding along a cold water pipe behind the floral wallpaper, gripping a single wooden match between the needles of his teeth? Who could not see him rounding a corner, the blue tip scratching against a rough-hewn beam, the sudden flare, and the creature, for one bright, shining moment, suddenly thrust ahead of his time, now a fire starter, now a torch-bearer in a forgotten ritual, little brown druid illuminating some ancient night. And who could fail to notice, lit up in the blazing insulation, the tiny looks of wonderment on the faces of his fellow mice, one-time inhabitants of what once was your house in the country. Thank you. This is a poem about something that American children, I don't know if they do it in other countries, American children do in the summertime. And it's called The Lanyard. And as with some of these poems, I try to kind of start the poem by talking about how the poem kind of got started. So it's kind of backing up the poem a little bit. Because one thing about writing poems is that, you might have a poem in your head and then you think about it a lot and then you finally write it down. But all of that pre-thinking, the reader is not in on that. So often when you start to write, you're way ahead of the reader, so sometimes I try to back it up and talk about the occasion of the poem's beginning. The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the pale blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift for my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard or wear one, if that's what you did with them, but that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim, and I in turn presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education, and here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. Oh, I'm going to read we should finish soon, right? So maybe I'll just read. I won't read those. I'll just read a poem that's not very new, but it's called Forgetfulness, and it has I'm reading it because the audience for it is increasing every day. And it starts out, it's just about mental slippage, that moment you have when your mind seems to be like an unfurnished apartment, when you're looking for some memory. And it starts out on the subject of what I've heard called literary amnesia, where you just forget a lot of the books you've read. Forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if, one by one, the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away, a state flower perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall. Well, on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. Thank you. So I think I wanted to acknowledge before I end the people who have helped me get here, and particularly Susan Howe, and thank you for that introduction again. And I wanted to say how happy I am to be part of the ceremony to follow, where the papers of Clinton F. Larson will be donated to the library. And as you know, he was already mentioned as a longtime teacher here and an accomplished poet himself. And I thought I would just read a short poem of his just to put the sound of his poetry in your ear. It's a poem called To a Dying Girl. How quickly must she go? She calls dark swans from mirrors everywhere, from halls and porticos, from pools of air. How quickly must she know? They wander through the fathoms of her eye, waning southerly until her cry is gone where she must go. How quickly does the cloud fire streak the sky, tremble on the peaks, then cool and die. She moves like evening into night, forgetful as the swans forget their flight, or spring, the fragile snow. So quickly she must go. And so I think I'll end with this poem. We were saying earlier, there was a little talk earlier about death being the kind of one of the obsessions of poetry, and I was saying that if you're majoring in English, you are basically majoring in death. Because if you took whatever anthology you're using of poetry, if you cut out all the poems that touched on the subject of mortality, you would have a pamphlet of poetry left. And so death is our thing. That's what gets us up in the morning and over to the window. And any time is a good time to write about death. It's like Martha Stewart says, it's good at holiday time or any time. But if you're having a birthday, that's a really good time to write about death. And if your birthday ends in a 0, then you're kind of required to write a poem marking the occasion. And there's a whole genre of poems which are basically midlife crisis poems about turning 40 and 50 and 60 and whatever, and they're all pretty much gloomy affairs. And I started this poem out with a satirical intention to just make fun of that kind of self-absorption on the parts of other poets. And the poem is called On Turning 10. On Turning 10. The whole idea of it makes me feel like I'm coming down with something worse than any stomach ache or the headaches that I get from reading in bad light, a kind of measles of the spirit, the mumps of the psyche, a disfiguring chickenpox of the soul. You tell me it is too early to be looking back, but that is because you have forgotten the perfect simplicity of being one, and the beautiful complexity introduced by 2. But I can lie on my bed and remember every digit. At 4, I was an Arabian wizard. I could make myself invisible by drinking a glass of milk a certain way. At 7, I was a soldier. At 9, a prince. But now I am mostly at the window watching the late afternoon light. Back then it never fell so solemnly against the side of my treehouse. and my bicycle never leaned against the garage as it does today, all the dark blue speed drained out of it. This is the beginning of sadness, I say to myself as I walk through the universe in my sneakers. It is time to say goodbye to my imaginary friends, time to turn the first big number. It seems only yesterday I used to believe there was nothing under my skin but light. If you cut me, I would shine. But now, when I fall upon the sidewalks of life, I skin my knees. I bleed. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have to say, can I please be the field of cornflowers at dusk? Remember, there's books for sale, and there will be a signing right now. So thank you all for coming. I'm sure you feel richly rewarded.